this was an act of terror, and a particularly cowardly act of terror aimed at innocent civilians, aimed at people going about their lives who had no idea of what was about to hit them.
New York Mayor Bill de Blasio today calling today's attack an act of terror. A few hours after it, the president wrote on Twitter, "We must not allow ISIS to return or enter our country after defeating them in the Middle East and elsewhere. Enough." Later this evening, the president followed up tweeting, "I've just ordered Homeland Security to step up our already extreme vetting program. Being politically correct is fine, but not for this." I want to bring in our panel. Malcolm Nance is a 35-year intelligence veteran, including with Special Operations and Homeland Security. Rukmini Callimachi is a foreign correspondent for the New York Times covering Islamic extremism. And Jeremy Bash is a former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. All three are MSNBC analysts, and I am grateful to you all for being here tonight on a complicated night when we've got a lot to dissect. Rukmini, let me start with you. These things are becoming familiar to us.
Yes.
We have specificity about how they go, and this one went the way they go, and in particular it went the way ISIS prescribes, has been prescribing in the last year or so that these attacks should go. Give me some of the details and how it compares to what we've seen.
Sure. So for some time now, Al-Qaeda before ISIS and now ISIS has been calling for car attacks. In November of last year, they put out their magazine, Rumiyah, where they were even more specific. They said use a truck, not an SUV, and make sure to run over the people until you can't drive any further. Get out on foot, use a secondary arm, a knife or a gun to continue killing people until you have an altercation with the police where you're supposed to be killed. They also said to leave a note.
They're actually specific about leave a note in the car, in the truck.
They actually said to throw it out the window of the car, which is a little bit difficult if you're driving. But if this person was indeed acting on the inspiration or on the orders of the Islamic State, he has carried it out very closely to what they prescribed.
Except he didn't get killed.
Except he didn't get killed.
Is that problematic for the people who inspire these things?
It is in the sense that ISIS in general does not claim the attack if the attacker is in custody. For example, the Chelsea bomber. The Chelsea bomber caused at least 24 injuries when he set off his bomb. His diary later that was found on him the next day, stained with his blood, actually mentioned Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who's the spokesman of ISIS and the official inside ISIS that was the most vocal in calling for attacks overseas. They had every reason to claim it, and yet they didn't. He was in custody. He was in custody, and that seems to be the pattern.
So far, that's by the book. Malcolm, the idea that he's in custody, we understand that he's not talking at the moment, and may not. But is it a very good thing that he's in custody? Are intelligence and investigators going to be able to get something out of him?
Well, it's very good, that he's in custody for us. ISIS, of course, on the other hand, wouldn't agree, except for the fact that they prefer you dead, and they prefer you to be a martyr, but they also like the idea that you're still in the face of the infidels. He's going to be undergoing an interrogation by a high-value interrogation group. And they are going, we've already heard early on that he's not going to be getting his rights because this could be a case of continuing terrorism incident. So we don't know whether this was the first attack that was spontaneous. Obviously it was planned in some way. He came up here, he got a vehicle, came through the tunnel, carried out an attack. Or whether this is going to be the first of a chain of attacks. And they're going to be trying to get as much information as possible out of him on his bed, on the hospital bed, to see whether he's the talkative type of jihadi, because we've had many of these people, people I've been around, they brag. And then you have, the closed up type of terrorist who won't say a word and will just smile.
Imagine he'd be on a suicide watch, too, to make sure that he doesn't try and kill himself while he's in hospital. Well,
I think that if there's any risk of that, it's that he will try to go and get a gun. I mean, the whole purpose of him carrying the air rifle, the paintball gun and the BB gun was to die as a martyr in the face of of what he considers his opposition.
Some good police work today. Jeremy, let me ask you about the tweet that the president sent out about increasing the extreme vetting. We know this guy was a green card holder. He's been in the United States since 2010. We certainly don't have enough information on how he got in and what would have been on his application to get into the United States to know whether extreme vetting would have helped in this case. What do you make of this?
Well, there already is extreme vetting for people who have lawful permanent resident status, green card status, In fact, the president's travel ban would not apply to green card holders, and it would not apply to people from Uzbekistan. So I'm not sure what the president means. I think, frankly, he's just looking for a "I'm tough on terrorism" headline in the wake of this heartbreaking incident in Manhattan. But really the big question, I think, Ali, is whether or not this individual was tied in any way to a international terrorist cell. It appears, because he conducted a vehicular attack, that he has followed the model that we've seen in Europe and elsewhere, in Barcelona recently, obviously in London, in France as well, where he acts alone, maybe inspired by ISIS propaganda. But I don't think we necessarily can leap to that conclusion yet without running his travel records, running his credit card numbers, looking at his banking activity, looking at who he's been in communication with, looking at his email, his phone records, and figuring out his community there in New Jersey, and figuring out whether or not there was any connections between him and people who might have told him to do this.
And WNBC spoke to people in Paterson, New Jersey, spoke to somebody who apparently knew something about him. Let's listen to what we know.
He did not apparently go to the mosque around the corner very much. People here who are very faithful, who do go to the mosque, who talk about peace and love for the United States, say that they saw him maybe once or twice in the mosque that is just a few yards away from me. But they would see him in front of the building where he lives. It's a small apartment building where he would socialize with several others. They believe they were all talking the language of Uzbekistan, which of course has its own language at this point.
WNBC's Brian Thompson in Paterson, New Jersey. How do we process all this information? He's not, as Jeremy said, this is not a guy who came in recently. He's not a guy who would have been subject. He would have been vetted if he had a green card and would not have been subject to a travel ban. How do we make sense of this?
First of all, we know that he came in 2010. That's before the Islamic State becomes the Islamic State as we know it today. So the idea that this guy, unless there's other travel that we don't know about, the idea that this person came from over there to over here, sent by the Islamic State, seems to be erroneous, okay? What we're looking at is somebody who, at least according to the facts that have been displayed to us tonight, was radicalized here. Now the question is, was he radicalized by himself, by going into ISIS Telegram channels that both Malcolm and I are also in, and just taking in the propaganda on his own? Or was there a digital connection with ISIS? Was he speaking to an ISIS handler? And more in the cases that we're seeing, including the case in Berlin, which is very similar to this one, where a truck was used to ram into people, what we are seeing is cyber coaching by the Islamic State. They are speaking to somebody who is in Libya, who is in Iraq, who is in Syria, who is possibly elsewhere, and who gives them ideas and helps them translate their ideology into an act of violence.
And Malcolm, this is what we're going to have to, we've talked about this many times. Again, the three of us get stuck whenever there's one of these things, trying to make sense of things that are very hard to make sense of. But this is where these things are going. If there are people who are either radicalized because they were fighting overseas, or they're radicalizing themselves or getting the cyber coaching, it does take a different approach to try and combat this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what you're looking at is the future of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, Al-Qaeda still maintains itself as a covert organization operating in a terrorist, underground. ISIS, on the other hand, was this large expeditionary army that has just had their heart, central caliphate destroyed. And what they're doing is they're going to what I call the ghost jihad.
You used an expression the other day when we were on TV together. It's like stepping on a ball of mercury.
Stepping on a ball of mercury, which we saw in Iraq, when I was fighting in Iraq. You step on that ball of mercury, it breaks up and goes into a million little pieces and actually congeals and conforms, comes back together. Once you've lifted that, mercury has to be sopped up. One little section at a time. And what we're seeing with ISIS is when that pressure came down, you suddenly saw foreign fighters in Marawi in the southern Philippines. ISIS suddenly popping up in the Sahel, which was Al-Qaeda's terrain. Niger, for example, that 50-man ambush is technically unprecedented for them. When they got pushed out of Libya, that's where these guys went, and Boko Haram broke up. So all of these things are occurring, but they are also still doing that virtual command and control, as Rukmini said just a moment ago. It's really virtual case officering, right? We're handling you. We're going to give you ideas. We're going to inspire you. This could just be one person who's been tasked out to handle the eastern seaboard of the United States. But when you come into those, dark web chat rooms, these guys are looking for talent, and they don't care how amateur you are.
Right.
They will carry it out, whatever act out that you can carry out.
Jeremy, to your point, and Malcolm and Rukmini and I have had this conversation so many times that they can't be making it up. This is not the kind of thing that the constant ongoing drumbeat of extreme vetting is going to solve. It is just more sophisticated than that.
It is, and it requires a lot of careful work with our partners and allies overseas, because most of these individuals have some connection back to another country. We don't know if that's the case here yet. I think it remains to be seen. But we've seen that in the cases in Europe. And we need to actually upgrade their capabilities, their law enforcement, their intelligence capabilities. We have to train them. We have to do that all across North Africa and Europe and the Middle East. It's a huge challenge. And here at home, I would just end by saying we have to make sure that the cure is not worse than the disease. We don't want to live in Fortress America. We don't want to have barricades everywhere. We want Manhattan. We want our cities and our towns to be open and a place where people can stroll at night on a beautiful fall evening.
Well, I will say this, that the police are doing their work in lower Manhattan, but New York is out. Making a point of the fact that it's Halloween, and they're out, and that's what they do. Thank you to the three of you. My thanks to Malcolm Nance, Rukmini Callimachi, and Jeremy Bash. Still ahead.